Morning. Good morning. Good morning. Happy Friday. Ooh, it is, y'all. It's not even October anymore. I feel like I take 1 week off, and the end of the whole month is pretty much here. Let me get started. I just opened up my Instagram, and like the first thing I see is the world news, and it just seems like it's kind of crumbling around us. And for anyone who's interested in therapy, healing, feeling better, reducing your stress, changing your life, whatever, wherever anyone is in their journey, um, you know, I just really like to remind my clients that it is a really, really chaotic time right now. It is, like I said, when I opened up Instagram and I just see the world's kind of like we got Acapulco, can't talk, who's just going through a hurricane. We still have the Gaza war going on. We still have the Ukraine-Russian war going on. We still have so many people suffering just right in this very great country that we live in America. And we have our own problems and our own issues. And I just also got done watching a reel, which is partly why I like social media, even though it can be like a void of a lot of chaos. But I just came across this reel of a creator going through the definition of the word sonder, which I've heard the word before, but the meaning of it, I was like, you know what, that brings me back. That's going to be a word for me to journal on. And so there's my segue into today's topic, which is journaling and how to do it. Are you doing it? Why aren't you doing it? All of the things that I find that within my practice with my clients, do they struggle with in getting started on, either starting journaling or being able to work on their mental health. So I'm going to go over some of the main issues or conflicts that a lot of people tend to struggle with and that I help them through with therapy. And then hopefully, someone who, if therapy's not your cup of tea, but you are a very, reflective and introspective type of person, that maybe some of these could help get you a little bit more in the groove with how you take care of yourself and how you reduce your trauma footprint, how you help others, heal and support on their journeys without having to break relationships or create hurt in your life or other people's lives, right? Although it's not something that you can always avoid, there is some things that you can do to mitigate the impact for how you grow as an individual. So I say all of this today just to kind of honor there is a really heavy presence right now that regardless of what you believe in, whether it's fundamentally faith or religion, there is just an essence of conflict that's going on right now that you can't really avoid. So if maybe it's a person on a customer service line that you're calling to get your Wi-Fi service addressed, right, and they have a short tone and you think they're being rude towards you, you can't avoid the air of tension, but usually it's not about you, especially if you call in and it happens in the first 30 seconds. You don't know that person, right? So it's like, why is it so easy to personalize that? Well, my first thing is that we have to remember that we're all protected, but we're naturally unprotected. We do not have a system in our brain already set up that is like, oh, I'm protected. That's not about me, right? So we're constantly exposed to other people's energy. And this is why I think journaling, if you're anything like me, you've heard about journaling for your whole life. You've heard the benefits of it. You've not been able to do it. You've had poor experiences. One of the most common, I think, feedback that I get from my clients about when I recommend journaling, they're like, no, I'm not a big journaler. I don't like to write. Can I type it? But it's because they have a privacy violation, that they had a parent that was very, dysregulated in their own right, and they just pass that on, right? But they also they had no boundary respect because they didn't realize that boundaries respect, and probably their boundaries were disrespected in a lot of ways. And so I say that to kind of highlight, remember that we all are naturally unprotected from each other, which is why we have to be quite intentional about making sure that we know and trust that we are protected, right? So we don't have this natural boundary in place for us, and that requires us to be prepared. Now, how you do some of that preparation and with intention is with journaling, because if you guys have ever been in a situation, right, where like you had a long day, you've been out dealing with the general public, you have been, just exposed to people, and you feel like, I'm like, yo, I had just had so many negative people around me. I had so many and you start to get an attitude, or you start to react back to them. Well, journaling is one of those intentional behaviors. And this is where we say it takes action to change, right? But we can keep it simple. Journaling is just, very slow motion, but it is a behavior that we can do that kind of flushes out your system of exposure. So if you were to put this in true, or an analogy context, right? When we had COVID, I work with a lot of healthcare professionals. And when we had COVID, I was talking with a lot of nurses and a lot of, in hospital workers, that they had to have a protocol that when they went into the hospital and they were exposed to COVID, and there was a lot of, of the air circulation exposure that we had, or that they had and subjected to, and then they have to come home to their families. They had to remove their shoes on the outside of the door. If they couldn't shower at the hospital and get into, or decontaminate before they got home, then they took out their clothes, or took off their clothes before they entered the house, or in a private space of the house that no one was around, and put those clothes straight into the wash, got new clothes, went straight to the shower to decontaminate, right? So we had to do that for a virus that we couldn't see. So why don't we do that in essence for the people that we're exposed to, or the situations that we're exposed to every single day? That's how I picture journaling, is that if you can get to a point where you can be consistent with it, and consistent doesn't necessarily mean every single day, but it means that when you know that your cup is getting full, preferably before that, right? But your cup is full, you're going through something, journaling now becomes that decontamination and that system of us flushing out what we're exposed to. And so that's really where I think a lot of people, it is intimidating. I know, I got my journal right here. Here's another thing. Your journal doesn't have to be fancy. I picked this up at the Dollar Tree. The pages, it really just allows me, first of all, there's a lot of pages that are not there because I haven't been journaling as frequently, but consistently, is that it is just a flushing out of our brain, of the narrative. And so if you're in a position where you're starting your healing journey, if you're starting therapy, you're going to have a lot of flushing out to do. That's where, therapist comes in, right? One of my roles, I compare myself to a journal. I sit over here, now that I'm virtual, right? But I sit over here and I take notes and documentation purposely for, billing and to be able to, for me to get paid, but also because I have to keep a dialogue of, and a narrative for you, for me. For me to understand, okay, this person's gone through this thing. This is what we process, not only just to do in session, but ultimately I become the journal for a lot of people. And so you're going to naturally just get way more out of therapy or whatever experience you're having if you're doing your own account and dialogue and documentation of what's going on. So real quick, I want to talk about my first point here, which is, okay, what kind of journaling, what if I ask my clients to do journaling, they're like, what do I do? Did I do it right? First and foremost, there's no really one right way to journal. If you're doing it, you're doing it right. And so when I say that though too, but there are different styles and types of journaling. You can go out and buy a journal prompt journal of that has, broken down prompts that are very introspective, that ask you to go through. Those are really great. I've seen a lot of ones that I've been interested in, but I'm also a real big advocate is that you don't have to spend money to use the resources that you already have. So especially that's because I can't, when I used to work in the prison system, I couldn't, get all these journals out. I couldn't fund buying everyone a journal to have them in there, so I had to teach them skills that they didn't have to use money. So that's really where a lot of my coaching comes from, is being able to do with what you got already and being resourceful. So when you're talking about the style of journaling, sometimes we can go reflective. Sometimes we know we're like, oh, I really need to process, why I become irritable in this particular situation, or why am I triggered here? So that's what I dub more of reflective style journaling, that more introspective, trying to to really kind of process and absorb why it is that we do what we do. Another style of journaling, though, that I encourage people to do is just freestyle, like right into the mind. It can be a creative flow. It can be, just gibberish. It can be like what you did in that day. So that's more of like, like systems. And what I refer more to like systemic journaling of like, I did this today. This is what I do. Like, so, because if you're really trying to create and promote awareness for yourself, sometimes you just have to be like, well, I did some shitty shit today. And this is another reason why journaling is so important, is because you're starting to look at what is the internal narrative that you are running off of. There's a script. Just like when you watch a movie, the actors are, they are guided by a script in their presentation of this entertainment for you, right? But your life is also being driven by a script. And it is a script that usually we have really no knowledge about until we take a look at it, until we stop and we're like, okay, I just called myself an idiot. Would I really let anyone else do that? Do I really need to hold myself accountable to change by calling myself an idiot? I'm not so sure, right? And then, because I don't, maybe this is a rule that a lot of people have not, or a lesson, I don't necessarily rule, but a lesson of like treat the golden rules, do unto others as you've had others do unto you. Well, in my golden rule, we start out with like, do unto yourself as you have had others do unto you. You're not going to sit there and let someone degrade you and call you names on the customer service line and be like, even the most passive person is going to be like, no. Okay. So, but if your internal narrative, and the reason and how you'll see this is if as you write it out and as you talk it out too, you hear it. If you're calling yourself an idiot, if you're calling yourself stupid, if you're calling yourself, and I do this all the time, like, and being sarcastic, like, oh man, you fool. Like, just being sarcastic with yourself, that may be a little bit safer, but in short term, but long term, you're still promoting and accepting a narrative for yourself that you wouldn't accept from other people. So this is also why perspective, and why when people say like, oh, I don't care what people think about me, I'm like, oh, you may want to consider that you already do, and you're just blocking yourself off from that narrative of like, you may not know what to do to tell people how to treat you, but you sure as heck do care about what they think of you, because you've already internalized it. You've now are protecting yourself and locking yourself in and into a situation that is, you're trapping yourself in with a really unhealthy narrative. So journaling can be what flushes out a lot of that, because now you can actually physically see the manifestations of your own thought processes. Now, look, I've got some, blank spots here. I've got some like run-on sentences. I've got like blank spots again. Some of it is affirmation. So if you really, one thing, because I struggled with affirmations, verbal affirmations for myself. That was a very intentional lesson practice that I had to work on, and I still have to work on. But you can do more affirmational journaling, and then just, rewiring and redirecting that internal narrative very directly. You can start there, or you can just start and seeing with what you got. Now that in itself is intimidating. So remember that all my suggestions always come with a pairing of practicing emotional regulation as you do this. So because it is very likely that the biggest barrier that people are not journaling, and why they're not journaling, is because a central nervous system dysregulation and overwhelm, and they shut down before the behavior actually initiates. So if you're in that kind of situation where you're procrastinating, or you are like literally just don't even think about journaling after knowing that it's something that you need to do, you may want to seek more assistance in a coach, a therapist, or even a friend that holds you accountable to being like, okay, we're going to have a journal party on this Friday night, and we're going to start it so it becomes something that you're held more accountable to, right? Not everything you just have to do in therapy, but it is a safe, unbiased place and hopefully a judgment-free zone for people that you can go and you can do something about how having to grow and develop into this world and um, into your life and to recover your life, right? So, this is where, so there's really no one right way. Some things that you want to be cautious of in the process, that once if you've gotten to a point where you're like, okay, I'm more open to journaling, this whole discussion between writing or typing journaling. Now, I'm a big advocate, like I'd said before, is that, do with what we have. If you do not have a computer, then you can't type. If you don't have a cell phone, then you can't type, right? But I caution people about going towards the technology is because a lot of the issues that we're dealing with in the mental health world in terms of diagnoses, attention deficit disorder, depression, anxiety, major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, come from the relationship with technology and the relationship that we have to distraction, information, and just even light, right? So when we are typing on our phones, we're not actually giving our brain a break, just even though it is a good stepping stone. So if you have to start there, I would encourage people to use the end goal or the end zone to be getting into a notebook and paper and pencil. Because what happens when you're able to journal paper and pencil is you now have a natural system. This is where your protection comes in, is that regulate. So once you get the breathing regulation down, your writing will become slower. You'll have more attention to how the act of writing is a grounding skill in itself, that you can actually, you're not going to forget what you write. Because this is a common piece of feedback I get from my clients. They're like, well, I'm going to forget what I have on my mind if I don't have a piece of paper. I have to go find something. And I'm like, yeah, but you also will remember it. If the belief system is that you're going to forget it, you're going to forget it. So if you are able to trust that, like, okay, let me find a Post-it note. This is what I did my notes on today because I didn't have my notebook while I was multitasking, is that, but we are able to now utilize and truly tap into the power of mindfulness in just one practice that you're already probably doing in one day. And then be intentional about it for, like, create a list of things that you need to journal and flesh out either at the end of that day or sometime in that time period of relevancy. So paper versus technology, I'm always going to be team paper because it has a natural, like, it's almost like where they tell you to, eat your vegetables. It's like it's food, and then it's also like a superfood. And because it gives you more nutrients that provide stability and regulation for your system, paper is the same way for the concept of mental health. So that is a big one there too. So one thing, we already went over a couple of the styles of journaling, some common ways to do that. I'm going to come back to that because at the end of this, I'm going to give you your own journal prompt of, like, something that I encourage my clients to do as examples. But this is where I also want to caution you about how long you journal for. So just like you would be going to the gym, right? Like we all have, if you're just starting out working out, then you ultimately will have a certain amount of, like, energy that you can put into this first workout. That is probably like, oh, it's super exhilarating. But then it comes afterwards that you're like, oh, you get sore, you start to feel the pain, and you're like, oh my gosh, I broke something, I can't work out anymore. This may have been personal account of when I hired my trainer for the first time, and I was like, I've been working out for 3 years already and I've never felt this much pain, right? So the same type of fatigue and overexertion can happen with journaling. And journaling it comes more in the emotional sense. So journaling is about slow exposure to the mind and to ground yourself and to really be able to see that narrative reframe, recorrect narratives, right? But it is very possible to get overexposed to your emotion, and this is one of the biggest influences for people stopping and being consistent, is because you have so much to process, you have so much going on in your brain that you put value to processing everything. And this is exactly why I tell my friends, my family, and my clients that there is a reason that therapy sessions are only 53 to 60 minutes long, and recommended to be like more once a week, unless you need more intense therapy. Because when you depend on, so whether in therapy, the space to be able to move that emotion and to move that energy around your body, and you don't have journaling on the outside, right? Then you get too used to and sometimes overexposed in session and almost it creates this dependency because you're like, well, it felt good, but I don't want to do it without this. I don't want to do it on my own because now, and this is something as a therapist I have to be mindful of, is that that person has attached to me as being the catalyst to their healing, that they're not able to take true ownership and responsibility over their ability to recover and their ability to heal and to process, right? Sometimes it's needed to create that dependency at first, but then it can be a little bit difficult to like allow that person to go back into their own autonomy to create a consistency and accountability intrinsically to be able to do journaling on their own or to do their own reflection, right? So, but when you're doing that at home, you can be overexposed because there's some really intense things there. So you do want to be careful. If you do know you have some real like big kahunas like of emotions and grief, especially, so loss tends to come with those, that you want to actually put a timer on for yourself. Maybe look at maybe the first 15-20 minutes, give yourself a timer to check in and be like, okay, is this going well? Like, am I too emotionally exposed to the point where this narrative is just leaving me wide open? I'm just writing, I'm feeling, I'm doing all the things, I'm doing it right, but then it feels so wrong afterwards. Not right away. It's usually the next day or the day after. I call this an emotional hangover. So when you have like really opened up a lot of like a good release too, it can leave you feeling very tired and fatigued the next day and be a deterrent of you going back into that practice or going back into therapy session, because maybe the therapist, you had some like transference there, and your therapist at one point left you wide open and not feeling like you had the ability to come back to and regulate how you feel or understand what's going on, so then that you're not as vulnerable in a negative sense, that you're not as overexposed and left out, pretty much left out to dry for yourself. You know, it's not the worst thing that can happen, but it can be imbalancing. It can throw you off for the week, and we don't want to create that negative stigma in you to associate now with journaling, right? So something to be careful of when you first, if you're just starting, is kind of know where your big kahunas are. Know where, you know, for me, when I started, and this is why it's a vulnerable conversation, is for me, the death of my father was the biggest kahuna that I had. Me grieving was the biggest part of my food and my codependency on food, because I was trying to fill a role with coping because that I didn't receive a lesson on, not only just from my father passing, but then also just the construction of my other parental figures and the conversations that and the relationships that we had. So I never really stayed consistent because I had already developed an attention deficit disorder before the loss of my father, to really, I wasn't really engaged in a lifestyle that allowed healthy habits to be set in. And so when I flash forward 20 odd years later, when I was like, oh, okay, well, I got to do this work because, you know, I'm helping other people do it and I don't like to be a hypocrite. So I started doing the work myself. That Maisie, come here. Maisie, come here. Come here. She's not gonna stop unless. So when I started doing the work myself, I was using a series of journal prompts, which I am more than willing to share with you guys if you were interested in it. But it walked me through a question that had me reflect on like one of the most challenging days of my life, right? And I chose, you know, honestly, I don't have, this is where we have to be careful about how we choose things. We think we know what we want, but we really need to be attuned to what comes up naturally, because it didn't take me but a half a second to realize, well, I know the hardest day of my life, which was October 24th of 2005, was the day that I was late to school. And because I didn't finish my paper the night before and I went in late, and that was the day that my father passed. I know that can be heavy, potentially a little triggering for some people, but I'm not going to go into the whole process, and I hope you respect that. But I can talk about it now because I have practiced that narrative, I've exposed myself to the thoughts that I have been trying to restrict myself from, which cause a backlog in the energy that I'm producing, because it can trigger and myself and not even really know why, because I trigger avoidance of talking with people about loss, about death, about, and ultimately restrict myself, because now I'm trapping energy inside of me, emotion inside of me that I have not accepted, that I'm not okay with. And guess what happens when you try to avoid something intellectually? We usually do a behavior that reinforces our attention being elsewhere. So for me, it was eating. So for me, after a long day with clients and talking about their loss and talking about their stress and knowing how to deal with their emotion, I now absorb some of that. It's triggering and associating for me, but I've also taught myself, don't pay attention to that. So now I'm like, I'm driving straight, but I'm looking over here. That's not quite a safe situation. No, not that quite. So, and where journaling stepped in, that first, I remember like, doing that journal prompt, and I was a hot mess. I was sitting on my bed. This was before I had sold my house, and I was sitting on my bed and I was just blubbering, and after the day afterward, I was pretty much spent. I think, thankfully, I remember it was being like a Thursday or it was a Friday. And so I had a free day afterwards, so I could really take it easy. I had the weekend, so I could really just kind of allow myself some room, because I wasn't as good at it at that point of like, I could usually just throw myself back into work and distract myself from how I was feeling. But that at that point I had already been like, okay, I know what's going on. And I was like, but this was the first time I ever had an emotional hangover, then that's again a term I dubbed, it's not really a clinical term. And I remember I called a friend, because I knew, I was like, something's not right. And so I talked about it a little bit more, but a lot of it was like, I just really did need some feedback and some validation at that point, because I was practicing at the same time, not necessarily seeking validation from my other relationships, when I really needed me to validate and pay attention to the moment that I was in, which is why journaling is also another good example of like how if you know that you seek validation and attention for your needs from other people in your relationships that aren't necessarily, they don't ever hit a whole 100%, it's likely because that individual self-validation is really needed. And that's where journaling can really help. You're seeing the words on the paper, so you now have control over how you validate that particular need of yourself, right? So when you're navigating that internal landscape, which is why I called it, like, the journaling is really just, you're creating the map, you're creating the blueprint of how it is that you make sense of your life, of your experiences. And if you're having those difficulties, and what we're really talking about right now is that emotional exposure to your own self, you want to be mindful of where your difficult spots are, not to avoid them, but to be respectful that you may have to work up and around to conquering that particular hill in your life, and not just dive right into it. Because where you get overexposed, it really it causes hormonal imbalance, because you will lose sleep. You'll notice what happens, like, when you're too exposed to your own self and you don't have any like energy to, like, you'll get super tired because you'll be sleeping. You'll have a lot of racing thoughts. You just drew a blank. It can be in definitely feeling anxious. You can feel keyed up, but also the next day I felt super fatigued. I felt super tired, because I had just exposed myself to really this big intense emotion. And I didn't have quite yet, this is why it's going to be okay. But if you check out my resource library, you'll have the other resources to know how to move that energy around some. So you're not just sitting there and, like, I think a lot of my clients, they're like, you're going to make me sit with my feelings, Sarah. And I'm like, yes, I am. But it's not just sitting there and feeling helpless. It's you figuring out what part of the body is it trapped in. So you being able to move a little bit more and stretch and move that energy out, or getting up and walking. Sometimes I'll do some sessions when I was more in the office, but even in virtually, that's why I use my phone, For my sessions, because I can just take it and I can walk outside and I can, if my client is on their phone as well, I can get them to walk through an emotion, because our bodies, that's where I think I knew I underestimated, even after going to school and even after being trained in this, I underestimated the simplicity of what healing really can be, and how we do this in kind of micro dosing ways of like feeling the emotion, matching it with a physical, and then leaving ourselves with an openness to be like, I trust that everything's going to be okay. This is where you don't even need to be a Christian. You don't need to have a faith system. Actually, well, let me rephrase that. You have to have and know how to have a faith system. So you might have to develop that first. But it doesn't have to be a religion. It doesn't have to be God. It doesn't have to be. It really comes back down to knowing how you can move and trust in your own self, and then you can go on to identifying, a true religion if you really want it. Let me not get on a tangent this morning, but this is where journaling will help you guide that movement can now be the pen writing. Now, if you're like scribbling frantically because you don't trust yourself quite yet to not forget what it is that you really need to talk about or to process, then that will come in time. But you can also at that point be intentional about slowing down the pen, because that trust only comes when you match a behavior that is aligned with you trusting yourself. So maybe this particular message is permission for someone to like trust that you are going to remember it. If it is important for you to process it and the timing for you to process it, you will remember it. But see if you cannot write yourself like a little bullet point. I have so many either Post-it notes in my journal or little bullet point lists of things that I think are important in the moment that I think about them, but I can't quite break and make the time to journal a little bit more thoroughly on it. Then can come back to it. Half the time I don't get to all of them, because guess what? If you don't get it the first time, it's the situation and the pattern is going to repeat itself for the next time of when you're supposed to pay attention to it. And you'll also have hopefully the consistency within your own practice of journaling to be able to receive that message and that lesson then. So that is overexposure. So I really wanted to address some of the biggest barriers for some people, because it's usually our consistency is not a problem within us. It's usually a problem that we're trying to mitigate that has nothing to do with the thing we're trying to be consistent with. So a consistency with journaling may be a really challenging situation because you haven't addressed your relationship with time quite yet. And your value of time is still a little bit wrapped up in other things. So your consistency now and so that tells me that you're overexposed to the stressors and the triggers that it is. And this is where I probably would recommend someone using therapy as a resource. But if you do trust yourself to be able to be like, no, I said I want to do it. I'm going to do it. Putting that time intentionally on your schedule. Like I still have journaling reminders on whether I do it or not, that pop up every day around like 8:30, because at that point in my day, I'm definitely not seeing clients anymore, but I am, I'm in that space where if I haven't filled it with going out, so there's another reason a lot of people aren't able to be that consistent, is because we're going from like one thing to another. We're not creating those little moments and pockets of mindfulness in our days to be like, oh, do I really need to go do this right now? Yeah, and we have obligations. I may not have children, but I have obligations, right? Like I have a lot of things that I can put in my time. But if I'm feeling overwhelmed, if I'm feeling anxious, if I'm dealing with anxiety or I live with depression, that is your body's way of knowing like, the way that we're doing this cannot continue, or you will continue to be depressed. You will continue to do this. So we need to start changing the landscape just a little bit. Right. And so journaling is one of those. Trust me, like I'm sitting here, I'm already 34 minutes into this talk, maybe 30 minutes, because I think I took the first couple of minutes to just honor the tension that we're all feeling, and we're exposed to. But that even in itself, y'all, is like, if you're in your head, anxiety is, yes, it's not in your head. First of all, it manifests and it feels like it's just in your head. It's really in your body and your mind. If you're sitting there thinking at all about the severity of the situation that we're going through globally, or the natural disasters or the concerns that you're now triggered by because you're watching all of this chaos go on, then you're exposed to that or exposed to it. Doesn't mean that you have to be, in Mexico. Just being and seeing the catastrophic events of a hurricane for other people's lives. If you're an empath and you're naturally open, like we all are, then you're overly exposed already to knowing that there's a problem out there, and then sometimes feeling responsible that you have to do something about it, that you wish you could do more, that you wish you could do that, right? But it is good enough to be able to just honor and journal and pay homage to in your own thoughts that you're sending positive, like you wish you could make it better. You honoring that by writing it down in itself is contributing more than it is for you not to write it down at all. And some people call that prayer. And in my world, I call it journaling. So, it can be a practice of prayer. So, be mindful though, that you might want to consider prayer is usually an individual, like mental or a meditative practice for a lot of people, that you might want to consider having maybe a shared written component to prayer. So then that way it can be a little bit more focused on the things that it is that you're wanting to change in your life and not necessarily just continue to extend to other people. Okay. So we went over the right way to journal, quote unquote, the right way. Synopsis is that there's no wrong right way. If you're doing it, it's the right way. The cautionary things and barriers to consistency that I see with a lot of my clients, and like the overexposure and what to do. Just as another disclaimer, it's always coming back down to that regulation. So go watch one of my videos, it's the recipe, where I talk about the breathing regulation and like the somatic movement to help release energy as you're experiencing some of these things, as you intentionally expose yourself to things. Now, and if you're stuck, or if you can't do this, or you feel like it is more painful for you to do this by yourself, then that is definitely where you want to start looking for a therapist, someone who will help guide you through that and also can share a little bit of that intense energy, because that's where presence, right? Like I'm sitting here talking and giving this message out there, is that at some point it can be easier to hear it from me than to just hear your voice say it, or it can be easier for you to hear it because someone else is in the room with you. And my energy, a lot of that's why it's so important for me to maintain my peace and not overextend myself so much and work on myself, is because my presence for people is the journal. I am the journal at first, and I am the grounding principle at first. And so if you have that person, you don't have to share what you're doing with them, but if you have a person like that in your life, you can use them as a resource to be present for you as you feel some of these things. And you don't necessarily have to talk with them about it, because that's where that narrative, you not only seeing what the narrative is, also how it's written right now, but how it is that you are going to rewrite it or to change it in those internal thoughts. So what's happening is that your chemistry is changing. Your brain pathways are developing new introductory ways to be like, oh, well, she's never thought like this before, so let's make a path for it. We're making new neural pathways that slowly over time, the more consistent you do with journaling, is that you will plow through most of those new neural pathways into more consistent ones. And so emotionally, you start to become a little bit more tolerant to yourself. And because you've now created more bypasses away from the true intense emotions that are attributed and associated usually with those primary traumas that it is that we experience. Okay. So if you at all are interested in journaling, I'm going to give you guys what I give some of my clients as a journal prompt to first start with. And it starts with the affirmation card. So if you guys have seen any of my other videos, I use these affirmation cards. This is the Love and Relationships deck. I kind of go back and forth between that and the original deck. So if you've seen me hold these up, these are just really, I think they're really fun affirmation cards, because for me, writing my own affirmations at first was really tough. I struggled with that low self-esteem. I struggled with not feeling confident with myself. I struggled with not saying nice things about myself because I'm super sarcastic, and I was just like using a lot of self-deprecating humor and convincing myself that it wasn't impactful. Well, part of my transformation and why I lead with my story with that is because it's a visual representation of when I found a way that worked for me, and it's been working for some other people, and these affirmation cards have been it. So I used to pull one every single morning. So it was kind of for me, for it was setting my intention. But when I pull one for my clients, I tell them this is something that you can use as a journal prompt. What does this word mean to you? What does it bring up for you? Okay. So let's see what it is that you guys can journal on. And that's your little homework assignment. Ooh, this is a big one. Okay. Boundaries. I claim my right to set healthy boundaries and I allow others to do the same. Sometimes personal space is taken and sometimes it's given. And sometimes, if you're on the subway, it's completely disregarded and shamelessly invaded. I guess it depends on the day. Boundaries. So, how I would guide one of my clients to do this exercise is, you can take it generally like, what do boundaries, how do they come up in your life? Do you have any intentional boundaries that you set with people? Are you in needing of more boundaries, or you have no boundaries at all? What does the word even really mean to you? I'm like, yo, what are boundaries? Da, da, da. If you don't know what boundaries are, and this can be maybe like where you go, it comes away a little bit from the journaling exercise, but if you go into my resource library on the app, right? And if you need the link to my app, it's my website is in my bio on all my social medias, or you can just Google my name. And you can go into the resource library, and I have a lot of really good introductory worksheets for understanding the different types of boundaries, what boundaries really mean, because I haven't gone into that particular talk here because it's multi-level and they're constantly changing. Okay. So, but just reflect on the concept of boundaries. Where do you see them in your life? Where do you feel like you need some more? One of my main tips, and just since we're on the topic of boundaries, just real quickly, is that boundaries are not walls. They are not to shut people out, but they are what I talked about in the beginning of this video, is the natural protection that we know and trust that we can have and that we can fall on when we are exposed to people. So intellectual boundaries are really important for understanding how to even start journaling. So if you are reflecting on boundaries, hopefully that you can take this and be like, how do you remind yourself that you have to put down that protective sheath in a lot of, maybe before you go see people. Maybe it's if you run into someone else's negative energy, it's like, boop, boundary. This is more mental a process than anything, but you know, hit a button in your mind where you're like, okay, the saran wrap comes. I do this because I tell my clients that it's like a cloak. It is a cloak of invisibility. That provides a boundary between you and the real world, but you're also living the real world. Boundaries are not to keep you locked in. They're not to block other people out because you're blocking yourself, right? So if we hold really rigid boundaries, how is it that we loosen up a little bit without going completely in the opposite direction and opening ourselves up and having no boundaries or enmeshed boundaries, right? So as you can see, I'm getting off on a little bit of a tangent, and this is a topic about journaling, but you can use this as a prompt. How do boundaries come up in your life? How do you see boundaries? Like, how do you make sense of boundaries? And then go into more of the, like, where do you think your boundaries come from? Or a lack of boundaries, where do you think they come from, right? So that is your journaling prompt as you explore. If you need any help with it, please feel free to reach out, ask me questions. But that is, your fun prompt for the day, and take it in journaling. And hey, Lexus. And so, yeah, I hope the process of journaling can be, sometimes it can feel a little heavy, and not only just what you have to journal about, but a lot of it is, it's just another responsibility. Sarah, like, oh, I have so much to do. Yes, those things are going to eventually get done. You can either take the break and give yourself 10, 15, 30 minutes of journaling time to focus on how to maybe relieve some of the pressure that you have trying to do some of those things. But fitting it in the long term is way more beneficial than continuously putting it off, especially if you struggle with mental health issues. If you do not want to struggle with mental health issues, because we can all usually develop that, is that it's, if you were lucky enough to have a parent hold you accountable to writing and journaling before the age of like 7, great. My mom tried, And she was a really good documenter. She was really good. I think I got lost in the sauce of life, and from a young age. And then at the right time, I started paying attention, and I started really like believing the magnitude of journaling and making sure I was intentional to take that time, because it will slowly help me recorrect any of the things that I don't want happening in my life, and ultimately provide a transformation to your life. Okay. So that's it for right now in terms of journaling and how to navigate that inner landscape of what it is that you have to overcome. So I hope this helped someone. If it did, please, make sure you leave me a comment, like, share, all that lovely social media stuff. And I will be back next week with a different topic about how to align yourself with transformation in your mental health world and recover your life. So have a good Friday, guys. Have a good weekend. Happy Halloween for those who celebrate, and enjoy yourselves. Be safe.